Hello and welcome to Tea with Tolkien, an online community for the Hobbit at heart. We are inspired by the works, life, and Catholic faith of J.R.R. Tolkien and strive to encourage others towards a deeper love and understanding of Tolkien's legendarium by hosting a free book club, providing free resources such as our Silmarillion Reader's Guide, and by cultivating a vibrant and positive online community. Our book club is currently reading through this newly released book, The Fall of Númenor, edited by Brian Sibley. This book was released last November, so just a few months ago at the time of recording, and our community voted and chose to read this book as our first book club for 2023. If you would like to join in on the discussion, you can sign up for our free book club at teawithtolkien.com/book-club to receive the link to our Discord server. For the sake of our book club, I've broken down The Fall of Númenor into 10 sections, and so today we will be covering the first section from about this book through before the Second Age. So this is really an introductory section. I'll begin with a summary of each section, followed by a recap at the end of this of our book club's discussion for those of you who may have missed out on our live chat. This week we are covering Part 1, Introduction, about this book through before the Second Age. At the beginning of this book, the editor writes, The Fall of Númenor seeks to present, in a single volume, selections from J.R.R. Tolkien's posthumously published writings about the Second Age of Middle-earth. This collection is not meant to supplant the works edited and published by Christopher Tolkien. A few editorial notes. The selected passages and extracts are arranged chronologically. The editor also notes that the published texts are treated as being the final version. So in the situations where Tolkien had several different versions that he was working through, whichever ones were ultimately published are going to be considered final. Names and dates are amended to conform with those finally adopted. So we see in a lot of cases that Tolkien had several variations of names as he was developing these characters, but we can see in this book that they've all been updated to reflect whichever one was ultimately published. That makes this book a lot less confusing. Editorial interventions are presented in a smaller font size and indented. And if you're listening to the audiobook, there are two different narrators, one for the actual text and one for the editorial notes. So I think that is very helpful. This book draws from several sources, and it's what makes it such a wonderful resource for Tolkien readers. Previously, if you were interested in the Second Age, you said, I want to learn all about the Second Age, what can I do? There would be about 10 different books that you would need to check out because there are little bits and pieces of information scattered throughout them, and you would spend like $300 having to buy all these books, and it was a little bit confusing. So the wonderful thing about this book is that it compiles everything that Tolkien wrote about the Second Age into one book. This book draws from the Silmarillion, the Lord of the Rings and its appendices, Unfinished Tales, the History of Middle-earth, the Nature of Middle-earth, the Lost Road and Other Writings, the Letters of J.R.R. Tolkien, and the Notion Club Papers. Introduction. The events of The Return of the King point to a deeper story lying under the surface, which the public very gradually became aware of over the years. The editor writes, But for Tolkien, the exploits of Bilbo Baggins and the monumental quest of his nephew Frodo were but part of a far greater story reaching back into the distant past. In Letter 91, Tolkien writes about how his story is continually evolving and it seems to write itself as he got going. Tolkien had attempted to publish The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion together, but was unsuccessful at the time, and The Lord of the Rings ended up being published on his own. In his efforts to publish these two together, he had written what he called a brief sketch of his world, and this brief sketch is mentioned in the introduction, and it is the Waldman letter, letter 131, if you have your copy of the Letters of J.R.R. Tolkien. Tolkien writes, The next cycle deals, or would deal, with the Second Age, but it is on Earth a dark age, and not very much of its history is or need be told. The editor notes that this statement is curious because so many crucial events take place during the Second Age, but we'll get to that later. As time went on, new sources became available and the public began to learn more and more about all of the stories and tales that lay beneath the surface of The Lord of the Rings. When The Return of the King was published, it also came with over 100 pages of appendices, which was the only source for those who wished to dive deeper into the legendarium at the time. Then in May 1977, Carpenter published his biography of Tolkien, and in September of the same year, The Silmarillion was finally published after 4 years of work on Christopher Tolkien's part. In 1980, Unfinished Tales was published, and it provided even more details, and its success led to the publication of the 12-volume History of Middle-earth series. I also thought it was interesting to note that Akalabaith was not written down as the title of The Fall of Númenor, but it had been used by Tolkien when speaking with Christopher. Tolkien's recurring nightmare that inspired him in part to write The Fall of Númenor is referenced in letter 257. We also learn in this introduction about Tolkien's attempt at time travel, which was ultimately unsuccessful, but through it, the stories of Númenor came together. The Notion Club papers were another exploration of this time-traveling concept that he didn't quite flesh out, but we still have those and can benefit from looking through them. The editor writes, "It is clear from Christopher Tolkien's detailed study of his father's papers that the tale of the Númenorians and their fate was conceived in complete harmony with the Silmarillion and the continually developing history of Middle-earth and the natural and supernatural laws to which it was subject." At the end of the introduction, Sibley thanks Christopher Tolkien for his dedication and devotion to his father's legendarium. He writes, "Without Christopher's passion, dedication, and skill, the story of the Second Age of Middle-earth would never have been told." And I just want to echo that by thanking Christopher Tolkien, because now that we have learned so much about the Silmarillion and the Second Age, I can't imagine living without it, honestly. So I am so grateful to Christopher Tolkien for everything he's done for his father's legacy. Before the Second Age, The Lord of the Rings has its foundation in the Silmarillion, though readers were unaware of it until much later in Tolkien's life and after his passing. This section of the book is essentially a condensed look at the Waldman letter. For more detailed notes on the Waldman letter, you can read my full overview on my blog, and I will link that in the description. A couple things of note that we can see in this letter. Tolkien had set out to write a mythology that he could dedicate to England. The stories of the legendarium arose in his mind as given things, which he was discovering and recording rather than inventing. Tolkien's emphasis on linguistics and invented languages are at the core of his world. After this, Tolkien gives us a brief outline of the events of the creation of Arda and through the First Age. This is really wonderful for setting the stage for the Second Age, especially if you haven't read the Silmarillion before or if it's been a while since you have. God and the Ainur are revealed, and the world is created through music. The firstborn, elves, and the followers, men, come into the story. We learn about mortality as the gift of men, the fall of Melkor and the fall of the elves, the fate of the Silmarils, and a vision of the breaking and remaking of the world. Tolkien writes, "As the stories become less mythical and more like stories and romances, men are interwoven. So throughout the letter and throughout the legendarium, as time goes on, things become less cosmic and begin to operate at a smaller scale. Whereas at the beginning, we have the creation of the entire world as a whole. As we move through the story, we will get to know our characters on a more personal level and see the narrative unfold in that way." Tolkien also brings up the connection of the fate of the Silmarils to the family line of Elrond and Elros, which is something that bridges the First and Second Ages. So this is essentially a summary of the first couple parts of The Fall of Númenor, and now let's get into our notes from our discussion that we had on our Discord server. We've had the chat running for the last week, and then I hosted a voice chat last night in which we had a lot of people come, a lot of good discussion. So I just wanted to kind of summarize and go through what we've talked about for those of you who may have missed it. Introduction. The introduction serves as a great refresher for those who haven't read the Silmarillion in a while, and it's also simple enough for someone new to Tolkien to grasp it for the most part. It could be a little bit overwhelming for someone who is completely new to Tolkien, but I don't really think that is in any way avoidable because of how much information needs to be condensed in order to begin the narrative of the Second Age. For the most part, the Tolkien newbies in our discussion felt that the stage was set pretty well, but it was also really nice to know that they could ask anyone in our group for help along the way. Something that also came up was a clarification of the Valar, their roles and purposes, and what makes them different from Iluvatar. Eru Iluvatar is the one creative god of Arda. The Ainur are essentially angelic beings who are often called gods with a lowercase g by men. The Ainur who entered into Arda after its creation are called the Valar and the Maiar. The Valar being of the higher order, similar to archangels, if you could say that the Maiar are the regular angels. One comparison that was brought up in our discussion: think of Eru as the composer and the conductor of the music. The Valar are those with the lead roles in the music, and the Maiar are those with more of secondary parts. Now the Ainur know a part of Eru's plan, but none of them know his whole mind. Timeline of the Second Age. What did Tolkien mean when he said that the Second Age was a dark age? We have a couple of ideas. A lot of information about the Second Age was lost with the fall of Númenor, so in a sense it's dark because that means we don't know a lot of specifics about it. Several extremely horrible events happened throughout the Second Age, which would also make it quite dark. And then we also have the contrast between Númenor at its height of glory versus the ruin of Middle-earth that it is left in as we go throughout the Second Age. Discussion of canon. Understanding what our canon for the Second Age really is means reconciling different versions of the text, especially between the Silmarillion and Unfinished Tales. Ultimately, we defer to the published versions, but that doesn't diminish the importance of the other drafts. This allows the reader room to breathe, and in my opinion, gives more life to the mythology as a whole. Even though this book defers to the published versions of the Legendarium, this book also adds a little bit of new information which had previously only been published in the Nature of Middle-earth, so a lot of it is still relatively new. For example, I had not heard of the Dancing Bears of Númenor before reading this book, even though it was published in the Nature of Middle-earth, so a lot of it still feels pretty new and exciting. It is also very much appreciated that the editor has arranged these events in a chronological order, something which has not been available before. So overall, our group has been really excited about this book and very thankful for the way that it was composed. Tolkien's writing style. We came to the conclusion that Tolkien was like an architect in terms of world building when it comes to Middle-earth, but more of a gardener when it comes to letting his characters and narrative take on a life and story of their own. We also noted that Tolkien was moving towards revising his myth to align itself more to our primary myth towards the end of his life. But we were pretty glad that he kept things such as the world being made round and a few other things. I think that the things that set apart Tolkien's myth from our own do make it a lot more fun. We can also think of Tolkien as less of a novelist and more of a mythologist in the way that he's putting everything together. His initial sketch of the world compared to the finished writing is reminiscent of the vision of the Ainur after the music, compared to the finished reality of Arda after it had been shaped. That's something that someone brought up in our chat, and I thought that was a really cool way of looking at it. It was also mentioned that Tolkien saw his world as something that he found and discovered rather than created, in the sense that it was a found manuscript. There's also an aspect of the story being told as a frame narrative. We can think about the narratives as being written in universe by different authors, which will contribute to the reliability or unreliability of the narrator. For example, it was pointed out that Elendil is said to have been the author of the Akalabaith, so how might his bias against Pharazôn have colored his perspective in the writing? Just something to think about. The discussion placed an emphasis on the importance of the Waldman letter, letter 131, as something every Tolkien fan should read, along with On Fairy Stories if possible. Thoughts on the book so far? Everyone in our group has been a big fan of the paper quality of this book. I know that seems like a small thing, but if you get a book with crummy paper quality, it's not good. You're not going to read it. You're not going to be happy. The pages are thick. The pages aren't packed too tight together. The font size is great. Overall, it's a really enjoyable book to hold and read, and that's been quite delightful. We were disappointed, however, by the lack of a larger map. As a Tolkien fan, a lot of his books come with really nice maps, and this one came with 2 maps. One is in the book. It's quite small, and then one is on the back inside cover, and they're great, but they just are a little bit small. It might have been nice to have a really big map. The artwork alone, however, does make this book worth purchasing. It's stunning. It's so fun to see all of the color artwork throughout the book, as well as the sketches, and I really love them. Some of our members in our discussion needed a little bit of clarification in terms of what Sibley was doing as the editor. He is not adding his own thoughts or opinions into the work, but rather composing Tolkien's own words in a similar manner with which Christopher had done in the past, although I'm sure he's coming in with his own perspective and his own style. He's not inserting his own opinion or writing into the narrative, and when conflicts arise, they are conflicts within the professor's own mind. So some of us had an issue or questions with that, so I thought it would be worth pointing out in our video. In terms of Sibley taking up a role in editing and compiling Tolkien's works, a comparison was made to Smith of Wootton Major, in which the role of Master Cook is passed on, and I thought that was really sweet. Mortality. Death as the gift from Iluvatar. The connection of the elves to the earth, and mortality as a theme overall. One member in our group said something along the lines of, "You can't have what isn't made for you," and I think that's a major theme to keep in mind as we're going to get to know the Númenóreans a little bit better, and honestly, that kind of applies to all of Tolkien's characters. The sun and the moon were a hot topic of discussion, which kind of surprised me, but we talked about it quite a bit. The sun serves as a reminder of the fall of the elves, but also as a symbol of hope for men, and I like the juxtaposition there and the contrast. The sun and the moon are not divine objects and are not worshipped, which sets apart this story from other mythologies. They're seen as lesser creations because they only came about after the trees were destroyed. So that's kind of an interesting point. The fading of the earth. The elves stayed longer than they were meant to in refusing the summons of the Valar. We talked a lot about that. The fading of the earth and the elves within it was not a choice of the Valar, but the nature of the earth itself. So how does that affect the elves as they're lingering? We'll see as we keep reading. Last point is spoiler etiquette. In general, I think everyone agrees that large-scale spoilers for this book are unavoidable. Just look at the cover of this book and you can see what is going to happen to Númenor. But we should all try our best to avoid spoiling plot elements that occur within the smaller scale stories. If you're unsure whether something is a spoiler, I would err on the side of caution. And if you are joining us in our Discord chat, you can head over to the How to Use Discord channel to see how to tag things for spoilers. We also had quite a few reading resources referenced, and I'll provide links to these in the description. But we've got The Complete Guide to Middle-earth by Robert Foster, The Complete Tolkien Companion, The Atlas of Middle-earth, The Nature of Middle-earth, Nerd of the Rings on YouTube for lore videos. We've got the Tea with Tolkien Silmarillion Reader's Guide, several links to different Tolkien Gateway articles, and then it was also mentioned several times, if you're having a difficult time remembering names, check out the family trees at the back of the book in the Silmarillion, and if you're having a difficult time with pronunciation, check out the pronunciation guide. So with all of that, our next section will cover Foundations of the Grey Havens through the life of the Númenóreans, which is pages 1 through 42. And I will see you in the Discord, or you can follow me on Twitter at teawithtolkien, check out my blog at teawithtolkien.com, and if you are listening to this on the podcast version, I invite you to check out our YouTube channel. Thanks so much.